Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, so today we're diving into something that on the surface seems like this total 2,000-year-old medical mystery. But as we decode it together, you'll see it actually all comes down to modern physics and fluid dynamics. For centuries, traditional Chinese pulse diagnosis has been so heavily debated, but the reality is surprisingly grounded and honestly brilliantly engineered. Right off the bat, this is the central mystery we are tackling. Just picture an ancient doctor. They have no ECG machines, no ultrasound, no blood pressure cuffs, literally none of our modern tech. Yet, by simply placing 3 fingers on a patient's wrist, they could deduce these incredibly complex cardiovascular conditions and even predict heart failures. Seriously, how is that actually physically possible? For a really long time, opinions on this practice have been pretty much split into 2 totally incorrect camps. On one side, some folks claim it's mystical magic, this secret wisdom that's just way beyond modern science. On the flip side, skeptics totally dismiss it as a complete scam, just theatrical guessing. But here's the thing. Notice how both of those extremes actually abandon the search for the scientific truth? They're completely missing the underlying mechanics. And that brings us right to the core thesis of our source material today. Pulse diagnosis is never metaphysics. It is simply physics waiting for the right language to describe itself. Basically, if we strip away all the poetry and the mysticism, we can actually look at this purely through the lens of biomechanics and fluid dynamics. Let's get right into Section 1, the wrist's hidden mystery. So, out of all the places on the entire human body, why did ancient doctors choose the wrist as the ultimate diagnostic spot? Well, the answer is just pure, brilliant engineering logic. The radial artery at the wrist is incredibly shallow, which means there's very little fat there to block the signal. But the real kicker? It sits directly on top of a rigid bone, the radial styloid process. This bone basically acts as a perfect, hard base plate. When a doctor presses their fingers against the artery, that bone backing creates a high signal-to-noise sensor mount. It gives them this incredibly clear, uninterrupted reading of the pressure wave. And this perfectly illustrates a massive historic evolution. If you look at the ancient texts, docs actually originally checked pulses all over the body. We're talking the head, the neck, the legs. But over centuries, they eventually converged almost entirely on just the wrist. Why? Because the radial artery offered the absolute highest information density for the lowest possible operational cost. You didn't have to undress the patient, you just needed them to hold out their wrist. It was an insanely efficient engineering simplification. Moving along to Section 2, Physics of the Pulse. Okay, so they found the perfect location for their sensor. But what are those fingers actually feeling under the skin? It's time to replace all that ancient poetic jargon with hard science. When you feel a pulse, you probably think you're just feeling blood flowing, right? Actually, scratch that, you aren't. You are feeling a pressure wave that's being generated by the heart's pumping action. And get this wave travels unbelievably fast, between 6 to 10 meters per second. To put that into perspective, that is roughly 20 times faster than the actual blood flow itself. This high-speed pressure wave is carrying a massive amount of data about the whole cardiovascular system. Now, if we map these out, it's pretty mind-blowing. The ancient doctors used these poetic terms, sure, but they were tracking precise modern clinical metrics. A string-like pulse? In modern medicine, that literally just maps to arterial stiffness. Floating or sinking maps perfectly to peripheral vascular resistance. Rapid or slow is simply your heart rate, and an irregular pulse? They were describing arrhythmias, like atrial fibrillation. They didn't have our modern medical vocabulary, but they were absolutely measuring real, physical, hemodynamic variables. In fact, we can actually break these complex pulse waveforms down into 4 distinct physical variables. Those fingers were intuitively sensing the heart's pump function, the compliance or the elasticity of the aorta, the peripheral resistance of the microcirculation, and the overall blood volume. A practitioner's touch was essentially acting as a zero-cost, multi-parameter hemodynamic sensor. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. Which brings us to Section 3, the clinical mind game. Because honestly, the genius here doesn't stop at just the physics. The actual ritual of feeling the pulse was a highly sophisticated psychological design. Have you ever noticed that intense silence when a doctor takes a pulse? Well, that silence isn't just for dramatic effect. It acts as what we call space-time buffering. It literally buys the doctor uninterrupted time to mentally process all the data they've gathered so far. And at the exact same time, this focused, calm ritual triggers the patient's parasympathetic nervous system. It physically calms the patient down, lowers their heart rate, and actually reduces the physiological noise in the signal. And this beautifully sets up how the diagnosis actually plays out in practice. Because again, it's not some magical clairvoyant reading. Experienced practitioners are basically using a rigorous Bayesian probability model. Step 1, they form a prior hypothesis by just looking at and talking to the patient. Step 2, they use the pulse purely as a physical verification. Step 3, they update the probability of their diagnoses. The pulse is just the final physical check to either confirm or totally reject their visual and verbal assumptions. All right, let's look at Section 4, a 2,000-year cognitive trap. So a natural question here is, if this practice is rooted in such sound physics and clinical logic, why didn't it evolve over 2 millennia? Why did it essentially get stuck? Well, the answer lies in this massive epistemological trap. It was a 2,000-year-old loop of circular reasoning. Ancient texts argued that the wrist was used because unseen meridians existed, the lungs somehow ruled these meridians, and therefore the wrist represented the whole body. So they arrived at the exact right conclusion, that the wrist is the best sampling point, but they got there for entirely the wrong, unscientific reasons. And because they couldn't perceive that foundational error, their whole knowledge system just couldn't self-correct or evolve. To modernize this, we basically have to apply Occam's razor. We need to strip away that entire complex, mystical framework of the 28 different poetic pulse types. When you cut away the unscientific rationale, you're left with these 6 purely physical, highly measurable dimensions of blood flow: frequency, rhythm, position, amplitude, tension, and waveform. That right there is the true, scientifically valid core of the whole practice. And that leads us perfectly into Section 5, the digital sensor evolution. Understanding those 6 physical dimensions reveals something absolutely incredible about the technology we are all wearing today. Let's just objectively compare the two for a second. Human fingers? They're amazing. They cost literally nothing, and they're highly adaptable. But they are subjective, they lack strict calibration, and their accuracy varies wildly depending on the doctor. Smart sensors, on the other hand, provide objective, continuous, and highly quantitative data. What's happening is we are essentially deploying the exact same ancient sampling logic directly into our modern microchips. The tool is getting a massive upgrade, but the location, the wrist, and the goal, reading that pressure wave, remain exactly the same. And hey, if you doubt the validity of the ancient human technique, you've got to check out this data point. A landmark study back in 2013 showed that trained human fingers were actually 94% accurate in detecting atrial fibrillation. They were literally rivaling modern single-lead ECGs as a primary screening tool. So the signal in the wrist is undeniably real, and human touch is astonishingly capable of reading it. It is just a fascinating evolution of a single idea across time. Think about it. In the 2nd century BC, we had zero-tech fingertip sampling. Jump to 2018, and Apple and other tech giants introduced smartwatch algorithms doing the exact same thing, using optical sensors to detect AFib. And the future? We're moving that continuous sensing right into our earbuds, taking advantage of the highly stable vascular environment of the ear canal. But hey, don't count the human finger out just yet, because despite their high-tech nature, modern digital sensors currently still lack 3 incredible physical capabilities that your fingers inherently possess. Fingers can dynamically scan pressure by pressing just a little harder or softer. 3 fingers can feel the spatial distribution of a wave as it travels across adjacent points. And my favorite part, fingers experience bidirectional physical feedback. They can literally feel the blood vessel pushing back against them. Right now, a smartwatch just can't do that. So here is your main takeaway from all of this. Pulse diagnosis isn't magic, and it certainly isn't a scam. It's an ancient, highly optimized physical sampling technique that is currently undergoing this massive digital rebirth. Which leaves us with a really provocative final thought. If 2 millennia of diagnostic wisdom can be compressed into the smartwatch sitting on your wrist right now, what incredible health secrets is it going to unlock when it moves continuously into your earbuds? The future of ancient medicine is totally digital, and it's already here. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it completely changed the way you look at your own pulse.